They said, "You're too generous, Mom. You'll spoil them." I laughed then, a soft, uncertain laugh that came from habit more than belief, because mothers aren't supposed to imagine betrayal coming from the people they once carried inside them. I gave each of my 3 children $50,000, evenly, quietly, without speeches or conditions. I told them it was for emergencies, for life's sharp corners that scrape the unprepared. "You never know," I said. "Sometimes what saves you isn't the amount, but the thought behind it." I signed the transfers from my kitchen table, a pot of tea cooling beside me, the smell of overripe apples in the air. By evening, the money was gone from my account and sitting in theirs. That night, I waited, not consciously, just in that quiet way you wait for someone to knock, for a voice to say, "Mom, that was kind. Thank you." Only one did. And even then, he said it like it embarrassed him, like gratitude was something fragile and old-fashioned that might break if handled too directly. I am 70 now. I live alone in the house my husband built 40 years ago, when we were still 2 people dreaming of permanence. The shutters creak, the garden leans toward wildness, and the kettle sings a higher note each year. My days are simple: morning walks, grocery lists, small repairs that never stay done. There are photographs on the mantel that no one but me looks at anymore. Some of them have begun to fade, their colors drained by light and neglect. I sometimes wonder if that's how love fades too, not with a fight or a word left hanging, but through years of sunlight and forgetting. It wasn't that I expected my children to kneel with gratitude or send thank you cards written in gold ink. I only thought, foolishly perhaps, that generosity would be remembered as a form of closeness, that giving them something from my heart would remind them of what we once shared. I thought money, that dull, practical thing, might carry love's echo if given with tenderness. But money, I have learned, is tone-deaf to affection. It only amplifies whatever truth already existed. For Matthew, it became fuel for showing off. Photos of his new car, a watch gleaming under restaurant lights. For Nina, it was another project, another way to polish the image she'd been curating since she married her second husband. And for Jonah, my quiet one, it was a folded check, deposited silently, followed by a letter in his careful handwriting. "Thank you, Mom. I'll keep it safe. I hope you're sleeping well." Nothing more. No calls, no visits, but also no demands. Just that small act of decency, and somehow it was enough to keep my heart from collapsing completely. The silence that followed was louder than any argument we'd ever had. Weeks turned into months, and I realized that money hadn't built bridges. It had drawn maps of distance. They visited less often. They sent texts instead of calls. The old family group chat died without anyone bothering to delete it. It was as if, by giving them something tangible, I had made myself unnecessary. I had completed my purpose, and now I could fade from their world like an expired warranty. It took me a long time to see it clearly, to name the feeling without choking on it. Rejection. That's what it was. Not the dramatic, shouting kind, but the polite, modern version. Slow ghosting by bloodline. Sometimes I walk through the rooms of my house and remember how it used to sound. Nina's piano lessons echoing from the living room. Matthew's heavy steps racing up the stairs. Jonah's laughter soft but constant. Now, only the refrigerator hums, a tired mechanical heartbeat. I talk to my plants because they answer with growth. I bake more than I can eat, because the act of preparing food still feels like care, even if no one comes to share it. I am not lonely in the way people imagine. I am surrounded by memories, by the quiet company of everything that used to matter. But there is an ache that never quite leaves. The ache of being unnecessary to the very lives you made possible. Sometimes neighbors ask about my children. I smile and say they're busy, successful, always on the move. It's partly true. Nina's husband opened another business. Matthew's working abroad again. Jonah teaches at a small college upstate. They have their worlds, and I, mine. What I don't tell anyone is that I measure my worth now not by their attention, but by the strength it takes not to ask for it. I learned that lesson too late. A mother's love, when unreturned, has to become something else. Discipline, perhaps, or pride. A way to stand without applause. The money itself never mattered. What mattered was what came, or didn't come, after. No calls when I was in the hospital for 2 days after a dizzy spell. No visits on anniversaries. Only Jonah sent a card, unsigned but recognizable by the small doodle in the corner, the same sun he used to draw as a boy. That small yellow sun meant more than the 50,000 I had given him. I keep it in my bedside drawer, folded like a relic. Sometimes I take it out, not to cry over it, but to remind myself that gratitude doesn't die everywhere. Sometimes it just hides in quiet hearts. As I neared my 70th birthday, I began to feel something shift inside me. Not bitterness, bitterness burns too fast, but a kind of clarity, clean and cold as winter air. I started making lists again, not for groceries, but for truth. Who had been there when it mattered? Who had spoken to me with kindness rather than duty? Who remembered even once to ask how I was sleeping? The list was short, painfully short, but it was honest. And for the first time in years, honesty felt like a form of freedom. I used to think that motherhood was a contract sealed by blood and memory, that love was automatic and eternal. But love, I've learned, is not owed simply because you gave birth. It has to be fed, and it can starve quietly while everyone pretends the table is full. The tragedy isn't that my children changed, it's that they changed into people who can't see me without seeing a past they've outgrown. They call it independence. I call it amnesia. I don't hate them. I couldn't. Hatred would mean there's still something to fight over. What I feel is quieter, deeper, like sediment that has settled after a storm. I think about how my own mother used to say, kindness isn't inherited, it's learned. And you can't teach it by giving. Maybe she was right. Maybe I should have given them less and demanded more honesty instead. But what's done is done. The money's gone, and so is the illusion that it ever bought me closeness. So when people ask what I'm doing for my 70th, I say, I'm keeping it small. Just family. They smile, not realizing the weight of that phrase. Just family. The truth is, I don't know if they'll come out of love or obligation. I don't know if the laughter will sound real or rehearsed. But I do know this. I am no longer afraid of their disappointment. I've lived in that shadow too long. What I have now, peace, solitude, self-respect, isn't small. It's survival. Sometimes I imagine the moment when I'll look around the table, the candles flickering against tired faces, and I'll know who still sees me as more than a wallet wrapped in sentiment. I imagine the silence that will fall when I tell them what I've decided. Not revenge, not cruelty, just truth delivered at last. I gave them $50,000 each once. Now I have something far more valuable to give, my honesty. And unlike the money, it won't be squandered. And perhaps that will be the real gift, the one they didn't expect, the one that finally makes them understand what it means to say thank you and mean it. The moment that changed everything did not arrive with shouting or slammed doors, but in the soft, indifferent glow of a smartphone screen. It was early evening, and the house smelled faintly of roasted vegetables and detergent. I was sitting in the same chair where I had signed those checks 2 years before, scrolling absent-mindedly through social media, that strange mirror of our time where people show the version of themselves they wish to be. That was when I saw it. A picture of my eldest son, Matthew, grinning beside a new silver SUV, the caption reading, "Finally rewarded myself. Hard work pays off." The comments below were full of praise, hearts, and congratulations, but not one mention of the woman whose savings had paid for that metal monument to his self-regard. I stared at the screen for a long time, not angry yet, only puzzled by the simplicity of it. A car, a smile, a lie. 3 small things that told me more about my place in his life than any conversation ever had. 2 days later, Nina called. Her voice was brisk and hollow, like a receptionist reading from a script. She spoke about her kitchen renovation, about how the contractors were unreliable, about how marble counters were an investment. She didn't ask how I was sleeping or what I'd been reading. She didn't ask if I was lonely. I waited for a break in her monologue, a space to mention that I'd been ill with a cold that turned into something heavier, but she never gave me one. And when she hung up, she added, almost as an afterthought, "Oh, by the way, Mom, that money really helped us get started on the remodel. Couldn't have done it without you." Then the line went dead before I could say a single word. I remember sitting there, phone still warm in my hand, listening to the hollow click of disconnection. I realized then that money does not create gratitude. It simply reveals the hunger beneath a person's politeness. Matthew wanted status. Nina wanted control. And Jonah, my quiet middle child, wanted distance. The money, it seemed, had given them exactly what they wanted. The catalyst wasn't one dramatic moment, but a series of small confirmations that built a wall between us, brick by brick, until I could no longer see through to what had once been love. Birthdays forgotten. Holidays shortened to quick visits that ended with them checking their watches. My calls answered with sighs or postponed indefinitely. Even when I was in the hospital for a brief observation, nothing serious, just an episode of dizziness, they didn't come. Nina sent a text. "Glad you're okay. Don't overdo it." Matthew didn't reply at all. Only Jonah sent flowers, daisies from a local shop, with a small card that said, "For when silence feels heavy." That line nearly broke me, because it told me he understood, even if he couldn't say more. It was during that hospital stay that I began to think about what had really happened when I gave them that money. It hadn't been a gift. It had been a transfer of power. I had stepped down from the quiet throne of motherhood and handed them the crown of independence. They no longer needed to check in, no longer had to include me in their decisions, because the gesture had signaled, "I trust you to manage your lives." And they had interpreted it as, "You are free from me." When I came home, I found the house too clean, too still. The air held the scent of disinfectant and absence. I stood in the kitchen for a long time, looking at the stack of unopened mail, the empty fruit bowl, the faint ring of dust on the table where I once placed 3 checks and thought I was cementing our bond. I wanted to undo it all, to call each of them and ask them to send it back. Not because I needed the money, but because I wanted to rewind the moment when I still believed giving meant belonging. But pride held me back. Pride and something else. A growing awareness that maybe this was the lesson I had to learn, late as it came. The real break came that summer. I had invited all three of them for a weekend visit. It was Jonah who replied first, apologizing that he had to grade exams. Matthew said he might swing by if business didn't keep him away. Nina didn't respond until 2 days before, saying she would try, depending on the baby's schedule. When the weekend arrived, I cooked enough for 6 people, just in case. Roast chicken, sweet potatoes, the lemon cake they all loved as children. I set the table with the good dishes I hadn't used in years, the ones with tiny blue flowers around the rim. The house smelled like the past, like patience and hope. Only one of them came, Jonah, carrying a small plant wrapped in newspaper. He said he'd taken the night train because he didn't want to drive in the rain. He was thinner than I remembered, quieter too, but his eyes had that same calm intelligence I'd always trusted. We ate together in companionable silence, the kind that doesn't demand performance. After dinner, we washed the dishes side by side. He asked about my garden, about whether I still wrote letters to my old friend Claire. He didn't ask about the money. I wanted to bring it up, to tell him he was the only one who hadn't used it to decorate a facade, but I didn't. Some things don't need to be said to be known. The next morning, I woke to a note on the kitchen counter. Train at 8. Didn't want to wake you. Thank you for dinner. I'll visit again soon. He'd drawn that same little sun in the corner. The house was empty again, but not cold. For a moment, I believed the visit had mended something fragile inside me. But then the phone rang. It was Matthew. He wanted advice on how to write off his new vehicle as a business expense. Not a word about the dinner he had skipped. Not a single question about how I'd been. Just numbers, calculations, and entitlement. I listened quietly, then said, "You'll figure it out." When he hung up, I deleted the call history and stared out the window at the spot where Jonah's footprints still marked the wet soil. That was when I understood that love without reciprocity becomes self-erasure. A week later, a letter arrived from the bank. Routine updates, investment summaries, polite printouts of balances that no longer meant anything to me. But attached was a note from my financial advisor, written in her neat, efficient hand. If you're considering more family disbursements, please call to discuss long-term impact. I laughed out loud, not at her caution, but at the absurdity of it all. The long-term impact had already happened. I had given everything that mattered, and what came back was silence. That evening, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea and watched the sun drop behind the trees. I thought of my late husband, his quiet strength, the way he used to insist on teaching the children gratitude by example. He would make them write thank you notes, even for small gifts. Gratitude, he'd say, is the proof of character. I used to tease him for being old-fashioned. But now, sitting alone, I saw that he'd been right. Gratitude isn't etiquette, it's recognition. And once it disappears, love follows. The following Sunday, I tried calling Nina again. I wanted to hear her voice, to feel, even for a few minutes, that I still had a daughter. She answered, but was distracted. The baby was crying, her husband was cooking, the TV was too loud. "Can I call you back, Mom?" she asked. I said yes, though I knew she wouldn't. After we hung up, I stayed on the line for a moment, listening to the static, the the faint sound of another life in the background. That, I realized, was all I had left of my children. Echoes from rooms I no longer entered. The true catalyst wasn't anger. It was recognition. Recognition that I had become invisible in the story of the very people I once centered my life around. Recognition that love, when unacknowledged, curdles into something sterile and heavy. And so, one evening in September, I sat at my kitchen table again, opened a fresh notebook, and began to write. Not a letter, not a complaint, but a record. I wrote down every kindness I had offered, every silence I had endured, every apology I'd swallowed to keep peace. By the time I finished, it was dark, and the only sound was the ticking of the old wall clock. I closed the notebook and felt, for the first time, something close to resolve. They would come for my 70th birthday. I knew they would. The promise of inheritance has a way of waking even the most neglectful hearts. But this time, I would not be waiting with open hands. I would be ready, calm, deliberate. I would make sure that what little I had left would not go to those who mistook generosity for weakness. It wasn't revenge I wanted. It was balance. And the first step toward balance is seeing clearly. That night, before bed, I took Jonah's letter from the drawer, unfolded it, and read it again. For when silence feels heavy, I whispered to the empty room, it doesn't anymore. The silence between us became its own kind of language, one that no longer required words or arguments, just a steady retreat measured in unanswered calls and birthdays that passed like unacknowledged calendar notifications. I didn't stop reaching out all at once. I did it slowly, the way people taper off medication, lowering the dose until their body learns to live without it. At first, I sent small messages, checking in, sharing small pieces of my day, but the replies came late, clipped, diluted. Nina would answer 2 days later with a single emoji. Matthew would write, "Busy week, talk soon," and Jonah, even he, began to disappear into long silences between semesters. I understood that they had lives, responsibilities, children of their own, but there was something else in their tone, a quiet indifference that had grown where tenderness used to live. I started filling my days with errands that didn't need doing. I'd drive to the grocery store for a single lemon, stop by the post office even when there was no mail, water the plants twice just to feel useful. The house felt too large for one person, but I wasn't ready to leave it. Not yet. Every corner still carried echoes of laughter, the thud of running feet, the smell of Sunday breakfast. I began to notice how time changes sound, how silence doesn't just fall but expands, filling every room until you begin to hear your own heartbeat, as if it were someone else's footsteps. I realized I had become a guest in my own story, wandering through the museum of a life where everything meaningful had already been placed behind glass. It was around that time that I discovered Jonah's thank you note again. It had slipped behind the drawer of my bedside table, and when I found it, dust clung to its corners. I read it carefully, tracing the neat handwriting, feeling the small indentation his pen had left in the paper. It wasn't much, just a few sentences, but there was sincerity in it. I remember sitting down on the edge of my bed, holding that note like a fragile artifact, realizing it was the last time any of my children had written something to me by hand. I put it in a small frame and set it on the bookshelf, not as a shrine, but as a reminder that gratitude, however small, was still alive somewhere in the world. One evening, a storm rolled through. Sharp wind, heavy rain, the kind that shakes old windows in their frames. I made tea and turned on the lamp near the sofa, trying to read, but the words refused to stay still on the page. My thoughts kept circling back to a single question. When had I stopped being a mother and become a memory? The answer arrived quietly, the way truth often does. It had happened the moment they no longer needed me. Independence had been the goal, of course, the reward for all those years of effort. But no one tells you that when they finally become self-sufficient, they also become selectively deaf to your existence. In the days that followed, I began noticing small shifts in myself. I started keeping cash hidden in an old cookie tin, the way my own mother once did, as if saving something tangible would protect me from the erosion of attention. I canceled the family streaming subscription after realizing I was the only one still paying for it. I stopped sending gifts that went unacknowledged. Each small act felt like a reclamation, a thread pulled gently from the fabric of a web that had held me too long. I began to move through the house differently, not as someone waiting for visitors, but as someone occupying space fully on her own terms. My neighbors, a retired couple who had moved in next door, started inviting me for tea on Thursdays. Their names were Helen and Robert, and they talked mostly about their garden, their grandchildren, the price of fertilizer. They didn't know my story, not really, but they treated me with that simple, respectful kindness that doesn't demand performance. One afternoon, Helen said something that stayed with me. We always expect our children to circle back, but sometimes they just keep flying. She said it with a smile, not bitterness, and I felt something loosen inside me. Maybe I had been holding on to an expectation that no longer belonged in my hands. As summer turned into autumn, I began taking long walks through the neighborhood. There's something about the act of walking that untangles thoughts, one step at a time. I'd pass houses glowing with evening light, silhouettes of families moving inside, laughter spilling faintly from open windows. I didn't envy them exactly. I just felt a quiet ache for the time when I, too, was part of that kind of noise. The ache wasn't sadness anymore. It was recognition, a sign that I was finally seeing my life without the soft blur of denial. I began stopping at a small cafe near the library, a humble place with chipped tables and coffee that tasted faintly of burnt sugar. The owner, a woman about my age named Teresa, recognized me after a few visits and started keeping my preferred table by the window. We never talked about family, only books, recipes, weather. It was a relief to be known for something other than my role as a mother. Around late October, I received an email from Nina. It wasn't addressed personally. It was a mass message sent to multiple contacts announcing the launch of her new interior design website. My name appeared in the blind copy list. I clicked through out of habit, scrolling past pictures of perfect rooms, cream-colored sofas, glass vases, curated stillness. There was a family page, too, a photo of her husband and children, staged near a fireplace, all in matching sweaters. I wasn't in any of them. There wasn't even a mention of her parents. I closed the browser quietly and sat there for a long time, not crying, not angry, just hollowed out. It's strange how digital exclusion can feel more final than spoken rejection. You're erased not by words, but by omission. That night, I pulled out the old photo albums. Dust rose in soft clouds as I opened them, revealing the faces I had once believed would always turn toward me. Birthdays, beach trips, graduations. My hands lingered on a picture of the three of them sitting in the back of our old station wagon, sticky with ice cream, sunburned and smiling. They were so close then, leaning into each other without knowing it was love. I thought of how easily we mistake proximity for permanence. I closed the album and whispered to the room, "You were happy once, weren't you?" The silence didn't answer, but it didn't need to. I knew the truth lay in the spaces between those frozen smiles. I started journaling again, something I hadn't done in decades. Each morning, I'd write a few paragraphs about small things: the taste of coffee, the way the light shifted through the curtains, the dreams I could still remember. At first, it felt trivial, but over time, it became an anchor. Writing made me realize that I was still a person with a voice, not just a supporting character in someone else's narrative. It also forced me to confront the quiet anger that had settled inside me like sediment. Anger not at them, but at myself, for believing that unconditional love meant unconditional tolerance. I began to understand that boundaries are not walls. They are doors that can close gently when needed. One afternoon, while cleaning the attic, I found an old suitcase filled with letters my husband and I had exchanged when he was stationed overseas during our early years of marriage. His handwriting was uneven but strong, each line filled with gratitude for the smallest things: my patience, my humor, the way I folded his shirts. Reading those letters reminded me that I had once been seen clearly, cherished even in absence. It made the silence of the present feel even more deafening, but also more instructive. It told me that love, when genuine, leaves a residue that doesn't fade. I realized I had spent too long trying to scrub that residue away, trying to adapt to a modern version of motherhood that valued endurance over acknowledgement. It was in that attic, surrounded by dust and memory, that the idea first took shape. I would take back my narrative, not through confrontation or guilt, but through quiet action. I began sorting through boxes, labeling keepsakes, deciding what mattered and what didn't. I called my lawyer to ask about updating certain documents, though I didn't explain why. It wasn't about punishment. It was about symmetry, about ensuring that gratitude, not entitlement, was the inheritance I left behind. When the first frost came, I found myself standing in the garden, pruning the rose bushes. The cold stung my fingers, but I didn't stop. There was something cleansing in the work, something honest about tending to living things that still depended on care. As I clipped away the dead branches, I thought of each child, of Matthew's pride, Nina's control, Jonah's quiet distance, and I realized they were all still growing, just in different directions. My part in their garden was done. I couldn't force them to bloom toward me. That night, I poured myself a glass of wine, sat by the window, and watched the moon rise over the bare trees. I felt no triumph, no sorrow, just an unfamiliar steadiness. The first escalation had already happened, quietly, invisibly. I had begun to reclaim the space inside my own life. They hadn't noticed yet, but soon they would. When the time came, when birthdays turned into obligations again, and I was once more expected to smile and nod and pretend gratitude was still mutual, they would find a different woman waiting for them. One who knew exactly how much she was worth, even when they didn't. It began with a letter I had no real reason to write and no clear idea of whom it was meant for. I remember that morning with unusual clarity: the slow hiss of the kettle, the weak light slipping between the blinds, the faint ache in my hands from pruning too long the day before. The world was very still, and I had grown used to that stillness. But on that morning, it felt less like peace and more like paralysis. I pulled a sheet of paper from the drawer and began to write without plan or purpose, just the motion of the pen moving across the page like a pulse returning after a long sleep. At first it was only fragments, sentences that had been circling in my head for months but had never found air. I wrote, "It is strange to be forgotten by people you made from your own breath." Then I wrote, "I forgive them for not knowing how to love the way they were loved." I didn't cry. I didn't even stop to reread. I simply filled the page until my hand ached and the tea went cold. That was the day something inside me tilted, imperceptibly but permanently, toward change. Later that week, I took the bus into town, an act that would have seemed trivial once but now felt like rebellion. I hadn't ridden public transport in years, not since my husband was alive. Back then, he insisted on driving everywhere, convinced that convenience was a sign of progress. But I wanted to feel the world again, to hear other voices, smell other lives. The bus was nearly empty, filled with the gentle murmur of people minding their own stories. I watched the landscape blur by, the trees still bare but trembling with the promise of spring. It struck me that nature never apologizes for beginning again, even after the harshest winters. That realization sat quietly in my chest, like a seed waiting for light. I got off downtown and walked to the law office where I had once accompanied my husband to sign the first mortgage papers on our house. The building had changed. New paint, new receptionist, a faint smell of coffee and toner, but the air still carried the same mixture of ambition and fatigue. I met with a young attorney named Claire, no older than Nina. She had kind eyes and a professional composure that almost made me laugh. She had no idea how much this meeting meant to me. I told her I wanted to revise my will. "Nothing complicated," I said. "Just a few changes in distribution." She nodded, tapping her pen. "Of course. May I ask the motivation?" Her question was routine, but it startled me. For a long time, I had acted as if all my choices were extensions of motherhood, decisions justified by love, duty, or guilt. But for once, my reason was simple and entirely mine. "Peace of mind," I said. She smiled faintly. "That's one of the better reasons I've heard." As she explained the process, I felt a curious calm settle over me. The act of defining what would happen after my death made me feel more alive than I had in years. There was something liberating about knowing that even if I couldn't command affection, I could still direct meaning. I listed small things first: the silver bracelet from my wedding day, the stack of recipe cards written in my mother's slanted hand, the painting of the orchard that hung in the dining room. Then I reached the part about the house, the accounts, the remainder of what my life had accumulated. My hand trembled only once when I said Jonah's name. "To my son, Jonah," I dictated quietly. "I leave the house and its contents, not because he earned it, but because he remembered to thank me when no one else did." Claire looked up briefly, perhaps surprised by the candor, but she didn't comment. She only nodded and kept writing. Afterward, we talked about logistics, signatures, witnesses, the usual bureaucratic details. But beneath her calm tone, I could sense curiosity, maybe even admiration. As I gathered my things, she said softly, "It takes courage to decide where love ends and self-respect begins." The sentence followed me out of the office and into the pale afternoon light like a benediction. For the first time, I felt that what I was doing wasn't an act of bitterness, but of balance. I wasn't punishing anyone. I was simply restoring the proportions of my own worth. On the walk home, I stopped at the small thrift bookstore near the bus stop. I hadn't been inside in years. The smell of paper and dust wrapped around me like an old coat. I ran my hand along the shelves, reading titles without intention, until a thin volume of poetry slipped from between two larger books and fell open at my feet. It was by a poet I'd never heard of, but the first line I read said, "To live without thanks is to forget the language of miracles." I bought it for $2 and carried it home like a secret. That evening, I read it cover to cover, my tea cooling again beside me. The words felt like a conversation I'd been waiting to have with myself. Days began to unfold differently after that. I found myself lingering in the garden each morning, not to prune or tidy, but simply to observe. The first crocuses had appeared, shy but determined, and the air held that tentative sweetness that precedes real spring. I realized how long I had been moving through life on autopilot, maintaining rituals of care for people who never noticed. Now, those same gestures began to belong entirely to me. I baked bread not because someone would eat it, but because I liked the smell. I ironed my clothes not because anyone would see me, but because fabric deserved smoothness. These small acts became a language of self-respect, quiet but fluent. When the updated will arrived for my signature, I read every line carefully. The language was precise, the tone coldly legal, but between those words I could feel the heartbeat of my decision. I signed it with a pen that had belonged to my husband, the ink flowing steady and dark. There was no ceremony, no trembling hand, no cinematic music swelling in the background, just the sound of pen on paper and the faint creak of the chair. After I sealed the envelope and placed it in the drawer, I sat very still. The house felt different, lighter, as if some invisible debt had finally been paid. In the days that followed, I began to receive small, coincidental affirmations from the world, as if life itself were quietly nodding at my choice. The neighbor's little girl brought me a drawing of my garden, saying, "Mom says you have the prettiest flowers." At the cafe, Teresa told me she'd saved a slice of lemon tart just for me, because I always looked like someone who appreciates effort. Even Jonah, though still distant, sent an email asking if I'd read the new novel he'd recommended months ago. It was nothing more than a few lines, but the timing felt poetic, like the world confirming that gratitude, no matter how delayed, has its own rhythm. I also started volunteering at the library on Tuesdays, shelving returned books and helping elderly patrons find large print editions. It was simple work, but it filled the silence in a way that didn't feel like noise. One afternoon, I found myself helping a woman who looked about my age, but carried herself with the brittle confidence of someone afraid to be seen as lonely. As we searched for her title, she confided that her children rarely called. "They think I'm fine," she said, smiling too brightly. "But sometimes I just want someone to ask how my day was." I didn't offer advice or sympathy. I simply said, "I understand." It was a moment of recognition so pure it felt sacred. We exchanged phone numbers, not out of obligation, but out of quiet solidarity. That was how my small circle began to grow again, organically, honestly, without pretense. Spring arrived fully then, unapologetic and loud. The cherry trees on my street exploded into bloom, scattering pink confetti over the sidewalks. I would walk beneath them, letting the petals cling to my coat, thinking how beauty, too, knows how to let go when its time comes. Sometimes I'd stop by the law office again, just to sign minor documents or ask trivial questions, but mostly to see Claire. She reminded me of the world beyond motherhood, the kind of woman I might have been if life had allowed for second chances earlier. One afternoon, she told me she was expecting her first child. "I'm scared I'll never be enough," she confessed. I smiled and said, "If you love them without losing yourself, you'll be more than enough." She looked at me with tears she tried to hide. That day, walking home, I felt lighter, as if passing on a truth had freed me from carrying it alone. The midpoint of my story was not a dramatic scene or revelation. It was this steady unfolding of clarity, this quiet realization that I had survived the worst kind of neglect, the kind that dresses itself in politeness. I no longer needed their approval to feel real. I no longer confused absence with loss. I understood that love can end without turning into hate, and that solitude, when chosen, is not a punishment, but a sanctuary. The woman who had once waited by the phone for her children's voices was gone, replaced by someone who could sit in silence and feel whole. Sometimes I would catch my reflection in the hallway mirror and hardly recognize it, not because of age, but because of composure. There was strength in that calm face, the kind that doesn't need witnesses. I realized then that the garden, the letters, the will, the friendships, all of it was part of a slow, deliberate transformation. I had not started a new life. I had simply returned to my own. The world had not changed, but my place in it had, and for the first time in many years, I was not afraid of what would come next. The letter came in March. Though the envelope carried no return address and the handwriting was so familiar that I knew immediately it belonged to one of my children. I hesitated before opening it, sitting at the kitchen table where sunlight had begun to spill across the linoleum, lighting the chipped edge of the teacup beside me. For a long time, I simply looked at it, tracing the loops of the letters, feeling that old mixture of curiosity and dread. When I finally slid it open, the paper inside was thick and expensive, as if presentation could soften intention. The words, however, were sharp enough to draw blood. It was from Nina. The letter began politely, almost tenderly, but soon curved toward accusation. She wrote that she had heard through family that I was making changes to my estate and that such actions worried her. She suggested that perhaps I was being influenced by outsiders or confused about certain legal matters. She even mentioned Jonah by name, implying he had convinced me of something. I read it twice, my hands trembling not with anger, but with the quiet recognition that comes when you see a mask slip. The daughter who had once sat beside me in the dark after a nightmare, clutching my hand, was gone. In her place stood a woman fluent in condescension, one who feared losing control more than losing love. I folded the letter neatly and placed it in the drawer with my will. It belonged to the same category of truth. That evening, as the light faded and the room filled with the blue hush of twilight, I poured a glass of wine and sat by the window, thinking not of what she'd written, but of the tone she'd chosen. The polite cruelty of it fascinated me. There was no open rage, no vulgarity, just the steady hum of superiority, the kind that disguises itself as concern. That was the moment I knew the distance between us had reached its full length. There was no bridge left to cross, no language left to translate affection. What remained was quiet inevitability. Over the next few weeks, I began noticing small tremors of consequence from the decision I had made months earlier. Matthew called unexpectedly one Sunday morning, his voice bright and falsely casual. He asked how I was, whether I'd been getting out much, and then, almost seamlessly, began steering the conversation toward my finances. "You know, Mom," he said, "a lot of people our age are worried about elder scams. Maybe you should let me take a look at your accounts, just to be sure everything's secure. I smiled into the phone, though he couldn't see it. Everything is secure, I said evenly. I've already spoken with my lawyer. The silence on the other end was heavy. Then he laughed, a little too loudly. You got a lawyer now? That's new? I didn't answer. He shifted gears quickly, asking about the weather, about the garden, about anything but what truly mattered. When we hung up, I stared at the blank screen of my phone and thought about how love, when deprived of nourishment, ferments into strategy. Around that time, the local newspaper began running a feature series about aging and family care. One of the articles told a story eerily similar to mine, a woman whose children questioned her capacity to manage her affairs after she made an unconventional financial decision. The article described how easily affection can morph into guardianship, how quickly "we love you" becomes "we know what's best for you." I cut out that piece and pinned it to the corkboard above my desk. It wasn't bitterness that made me keep it. It was recognition. Spring came late that year, as if the season itself were hesitant to re-enter the world. I spent most mornings in the garden, clearing away last year's debris, digging my fingers into the cool, damp soil. The physical work steadied me. I liked the honesty of it, the way effort translated directly into result, something life with people no longer offered. Occasionally, neighbors would stop by to chat, their words drifting harmlessly over small matters. Weather, potholes, the upcoming town fair. I smiled and nodded, participating in the rhythm of ordinary life while my inner world tightened into focus. I was no longer waiting for my children to visit or call. I had stopped measuring time by their attention. Instead, I measured it by the slow, deliberate unfurling of leaves, by the scent of lilacs when dusk arrived. Then one morning, while I was tending the rose bushes, a car I didn't recognize pulled up in front of the house. I wiped my hands on my apron and straightened, squinting against the sun. The door opened, and there she was, Nina, stepping out in a tailored coat, her expression composed but brittle. I felt the air shift slightly, as though the garden itself were holding its breath. She approached slowly, heels sinking into the soft earth, stopping just short of the gate. "You look well," she said. Her voice was polite, practiced, the kind of tone people use in waiting rooms. "Thank you," I replied. "You too." We stood there for a moment, measuring each other like strangers in a mirror. "I was in the area," she said. "Thought I'd stop by." I nodded, knowing it wasn't true. She glanced around, pretending to admire the flowers, then met my eyes. "You've been busy." "I have," I said. "Work keeps me sane." "Work," she repeated, eyebrows lifting slightly. "Gardening," I clarified. "It's work of a kind." She smiled thinly. "You always did like keeping busy." The pause that followed stretched taut as wire. Finally, she sighed. "Mom, can we talk inside?" We sat in the kitchen, the same room where she had once helped me bake her birthday cakes, where she'd giggled at her brother's jokes, where her father had read the newspaper each morning. Now the space felt smaller, the air denser. She declined the tea I offered and folded her hands neatly on the table. "I won't dance around it," she said. "Matthew and I are worried about you." "About me?" I asked. "Or about something else?" She looked momentarily unsettled. "You've been distant, secretive, and we heard you've been meeting with lawyers." I smiled faintly. "You make it sound like a crime." "No, of course not," she said quickly. "It's just, we don't want anyone taking advantage of you." I leaned back, studying her. "You mean like how you both took advantage when I gave you $50,000 each?" Her face hardened, color rising in her cheeks. That was years ago, and it was a gift. Yes, I said quietly. It was. And do you know what gifts are meant to inspire? She looked down. Gratitude, I said. Not entitlement. She stood up suddenly, pacing near the counter, her composure cracking in small, visible fractures. Why are you doing this? Why are you trying to divide us? I'm not dividing anyone, I said. I'm simply setting things in order. By cutting us out? By remembering who still sees me as a person. She stared at me for a long time, and for a brief second, I saw the little girl she had once been, stubborn, frightened, needing reassurance. But that flicker vanished as quickly as it appeared. You're being manipulated, she said softly. By Jonah, by whoever put this idea in your head. I laughed then, not cruelly, but with a kind of weary amazement. The only person manipulating me, Nina, is the one sitting in front of me, insisting I'm not capable of making my own choices. She didn't answer. She just picked up her purse, eyes glassy with unshed tears, and said, You'll regret this. Then she left, leaving the faint scent of her perfume hanging in the air like an accusation. I didn't cry. I didn't even feel anger. What I felt was a strange, crystalline calm, as if the final piece of a puzzle had clicked into place. The past had finally clarified itself. The money, the silence, the manipulation. It had all led here, to this exact understanding. They weren't villains, just people so accustomed to taking that they mistook giving for weakness. And I, for too long, had mistaken endurance for love. In the weeks after her visit, I received 2 phone calls from unknown numbers that I didn't answer. Then a letter arrived, this time on legal stationery. It was from an attorney representing both Matthew and Nina, requesting a meeting to discuss estate matters and familial concerns. The irony was too perfect to ignore. I folded the letter, placed it beside Nina's previous note, and decided not to respond. Some conversations no longer required my participation. Instead, I focused on the tangible. I repainted the shutters, trimmed the hedges, reorganized the closets. Physical labor had become my language of defiance. Each task completed was a declaration. I am still here. I am capable. I am not done. Friends began to notice the difference. Teresa at the cafe remarked that I looked different, lighter, like someone who stopped apologizing. She was right. There's a peculiar freedom in realizing you owe no one your compliance. Jonah, unaware of the chaos brewing between his siblings and me, called one evening just as the sun was setting. His voice was steady, careful. How are you, Mom? He asked. Good, I said. Busy, productive. We talked about small things, the classes he was teaching, a stray cat that had adopted him, the weather in his town. Then, hesitantly, he said, Nina called me. I waited. She's upset. She says you've changed your will. I have, I said. She thinks I influenced you. Did you? He asked, not as a challenge, but as an invitation to honesty. No, I said softly. You just thanked me once, Jonah. That was enough. There was a long silence. Then he said, I didn't do it for that. I know, I said. That's why it matters. When we hung up, I felt something shift again, not backward toward guilt, but forward toward peace. The second escalation of my story wasn't about conflict or confrontation. It was about clarity revealing itself through the resistance of others. Each accusation, each attempt to control me, only confirmed that I was finally living as myself. By early summer, word had spread. Extended relatives called under the guise of concern. Cousins I hadn't heard from in years suddenly remembered birthdays. Invitations arrived for dinners and reunions that had never existed before. I accepted none of them. I had learned that not all company is companionship. Instead, I hosted small gatherings at my home, neighbors, friends from the library, people who expected nothing but presence. One evening, as we sat in the garden under strings of lights, someone asked how I managed to stay so calm amid family tension. I smiled and said, "Peace is what happens when you stop auditioning for love." Still, a part of me knew the story wasn't finished. There would be consequences to my silence. People like my children don't give up control easily. But I no longer feared the confrontation. I had weathered storms far worse: grief, loneliness, invisibility. What could they possibly take now that I hadn't already learned to live without? I wrote in my journal that night, "They will come again, not to understand, but to reclaim. When they do, I will meet them not with rage, but with truth. And truth, when spoken without apology, is the loudest sound in the world." That was the second escalation. Not the explosion of old wounds, but the quiet, deliberate reinforcement of boundaries that would no longer bend. It was the moment when I stopped being the woman who waited and became the one who decided. Everything that followed, every confrontation and silence, was simply the echo of that decision reverberating through the walls of a house finally filled with my own voice. It happened on the night of my 70th birthday, a date I had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure, as if time itself were holding its breath, waiting to see what I would do. The house was filled with the hum of forced celebration, balloons that looked out of place against old wallpaper, the clinking of glasses that carried no real joy, and voices speaking in tones too bright to be sincere. They had all come, which surprised me. Even Matthew had flown in from wherever his newest project had taken him, wearing a blazer too expensive for a son visiting his mother. Nina arrived with her husband and their children, all smiles and rehearsed affection. Jonah was the last to arrive, carrying a bouquet of lilies and a small box of tea leaves from a trip he'd taken recently. He hugged me gently, not out of duty, but out of instinct, and I felt, just for a moment, that he was the only person in the room who wasn't pretending. The evening unfolded with the same rhythm as every family gathering I had endured in recent years: chatter about promotions, new investments, property prices, and diets. Nina's husband dominated the conversation, his voice booming about opportunities and the importance of legacy. The irony was not lost on me. I sat at the head of the table, smiling when expected, nodding when spoken to, my hands folded neatly in my lap. My heart beat steadily, but beneath the calm surface was a tide of clarity so fierce it almost frightened me. Every story they told, every subtle brag, every gesture of performative care confirmed what I already knew. This evening wasn't about celebrating my life. It was about reaffirming their image of themselves as good children, attentive children, dutiful children. They didn't realize that this performance would be their final act. When the main course was cleared, I stood up slowly, the sound of my chair scraping against the floor silencing the room. The chatter faded into a nervous hush. I could feel every eye on me, waiting for a sentimental toast, a story about aging gracefully, perhaps even a tearful declaration of maternal love. Instead, I lifted my glass, the stem trembling slightly between my fingers, and said, "I want to thank you all for coming tonight. 70 years is a long time to be alive, longer still to stay awake inside your own life." A few polite smiles flickered around the table, uncertain of my tone. I continued, "This year has been one of great clarity for me. I've been thinking a lot about what we owe one another, not in money or gifts, but in attention, in kindness, in gratitude. I paused, letting the silence expand until even the children stopped fidgeting. 2 years ago, I gave each of you $50,000. I said it was for emergencies, for the unexpected storms that life inevitably brings. I told myself it was a gesture of love, a safety net made of trust. Only one of you thanked me. The air changed then, the way it does before thunder. Matthew shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tightening. Nina's eyes widened, her practiced smile faltering. Jonah lowered his gaze, the color rising faintly in his cheeks. I set the glass down gently. "That thank you," I said softly, "wasn't long or elaborate. It was a single sentence, handwritten on a piece of paper I still keep in a frame. It reminded me that gratitude isn't about the size of a gift, but the depth of one's heart." Nina laughed then, too loudly, the sound brittle. "Mom," she said, "is this really the time? We're here to celebrate you." I turned to her, and for once, she couldn't hold my gaze. "I am celebrating," I said. "I'm celebrating finally understanding who each of you truly is." Matthew cleared his throat. "Come on, Mom. Let's not make a scene. You know we love you." His tone was condescending, the kind a man uses when trying to calm a child or an elderly woman. "Love?" I repeated, tasting the word as if it were foreign. "Do you know what love looks like, Matthew? It looks like a phone call when someone is sick. It looks like a visit without an agenda. It looks like a mother's hand being held just because it's still there to hold. I haven't seen that kind of love from you in a very long time." Nina's husband tried to intervene, muttering something about misunderstandings, but I raised my hand, and he fell silent. I could feel the power shifting, not outwardly, but in the quiet center of the room, where truth had finally decided to sit down. I took a deep breath. "I'm not angry," I said. "Anger would mean I still expected something from you. What I feel now is peace. And peace, I've learned, only arrives when the pretending stops." I reached into the pocket of my cardigan and pulled out a folded envelope. I wasn't planning to announce this tonight, but perhaps this is exactly the right moment. The room tensed as I unfolded the paper. "I've rewritten my will," I said. "It's done, signed, witnessed, and filed. Everything I own, the house, the savings, your father's paintings, even the silverware you all keep asking me to set aside, will go to the one person who remembered to say thank you. Jonah." A stunned silence filled the space, thick and electric. Nina's mouth opened, then closed. Matthew stood up abruptly, knocking over his glass. "You can't be serious," he said, his voice rising. "You're going to give everything to him because of one damn letter?" I met his fury with stillness. "No," I said. "I'm giving it to him because of what that letter represented. Because gratitude is the only proof of love I ever received from any of you." Nina's face flushed red, her composure unraveling. "This is cruel," she said. "Do you even hear yourself? You're turning us against each other." I shook my head. "I'm not turning you against each other. I'm simply stepping out of the game you've been playing for years. You turned away long before this moment. I'm just acknowledging it aloud." She stared at me, mouth trembling. "You're punishing us." I smiled sadly. "If telling the truth feels like punishment, perhaps you should ask yourselves why." For a moment, no one spoke. The ticking of the old clock filled the silence. I looked around the table, the expensive clothes, the polished phones, the faces I had memorized since birth, and realized that I no longer recognized them. They were strangers wearing the names of my children. Then Jonah stood, awkward and pale. Mom, he said quietly, you don't have to do this tonight. I turned to him. Yes, I do. Because tonight is the first time in many years that all of you are here, sitting in this house, pretending to be a family. And I refuse to let that pretense end without truth. Nina rose abruptly, muttering something about fresh air. But Matthew stayed standing, arms crossed, his expression caught between outrage and disbelief. You're going to regret this, he said. You're making a fool of yourself. I looked at him calmly. Maybe. But at least it's my choice now. For once, I'm not the fool who pays for everyone else's comfort. He turned away, muttering curses under his breath. The grandchildren watched in confusion, their innocence cutting through the tension like sunlight through smoke. I wanted to tell them that love doesn't vanish overnight, that sometimes it fades quietly while everyone is busy pretending it's still there. But I said nothing. Some lessons can't be inherited. They must be lived. After they left, angry, humiliated, retreating into the night like shadows returning to their corners, the house fell silent again. Only Jonah stayed behind. He didn't speak for a long time. He simply began gathering the empty plates, rinsing them under the tap. You didn't have to do that, I said softly. He shrugged. Maybe I didn't, he replied. But I wanted to. His words landed like balm on an old wound. I watched him move through the kitchen, methodical, gentle, and I thought of the boy he had been, the one who always stayed behind to help clean up after dinner while his siblings ran outside. Gratitude, I realized, isn't something learned. It's something remembered. When the dishes were done, he turned to me. They're going to be angry, he said. They already are, I answered. But anger is just noise. It fades. He looked at me for a long time, his eyes filled with a kind of sorrow I understood too well. You know, he said quietly, you didn't have to give me anything. I smiled. I know. But I wanted at least one thing I gave to end up in the hands of someone who didn't ask for it. After he left, I sat by the window, the moonlight pooling across the floor. The night was still, almost tender. I thought of my husband, of the life we had built and lost, of the years I had spent waiting for gratitude that never came. And then I thought of the silence that would follow, the stories they would tell about me once I was gone. I imagined them saying I had lost my mind, that Jonah had manipulated me, that age had made me cruel. Let them. The truth didn't need defending anymore. It was already written, signed, sealed, and resting in a drawer beside a thank you note in careful, unpretentious handwriting. That night, I slept without dreams, my body heavy, but my heart startlingly light. The climax of my life had arrived not with chaos, but with clarity. I had spoken the truth aloud, and in doing so, I had reclaimed something I thought I had lost forever, the right to define my own story. In the weeks after the birthday, the house settled into a silence that felt different from the one that had haunted it before. It was no longer the silence of neglect, nor the silence of waiting. It was clean, deliberate, almost sacred, the kind of quiet that follows the end of a storm when the air still smells of rain and broken branches. I woke each morning to light spilling softly across the kitchen floor, and for the first time in years, that light did not feel like an accusation. I brewed my tea slowly, without glancing at my phone, without expecting any messages that never came. They had stopped calling, of course. Even Jonah, cautious not to provoke his siblings, kept his distance for a while. But the absence no longer felt like a wound. It felt like the closing of a chapter I had rewritten in my own handwriting. There were small ripples of consequence, of course. There always are. A letter from Matthew arrived first, shorter and angrier than the one Nina had sent before. He wrote that he couldn't understand how a mother could humiliate her own children in front of their families, that I had chosen sides and destroyed what little unity we had left. I read it twice, folded it neatly, and placed it beside the first one. A few days later, an email from Nina appeared in my inbox, cold, formal, and full of the legal language she must have copied from someone else. She wrote that she and Matthew were reviewing options and that it wasn't too late to reconsider. I didn't respond. There are kinds of peace that only survive in silence, and I had finally learned how to protect mine. Life became quieter, but also strangely more vivid. Without the constant background noise of expectation and disappointment, I began to hear smaller, truer sounds. The steady drip of the faucet, the hum of bees outside the window, the soft creak of wood expanding under the afternoon sun. I started walking every day, farther each time, through neighborhoods I had never bothered to explore. Sometimes I'd stop at the cafe, where Teresa would wave and pour me a cup before I even asked. We didn't talk about family. We talked about plants, books, the texture of solitude, the way people mistake it for sadness when in fact it is simply space, the breathing room a soul needs after years of being pressed into corners. One evening, Jonah called. His voice was softer than I remembered, as if he were still afraid that gratitude might sound like guilt. "How are you, Mom?" he asked. "Peaceful," I said. "I think that's what this is." He hesitated, then said, "They're still angry. They say I took advantage of you." I smiled, though he couldn't see it. Let them. People will always believe the story that hurts them the least. "Don't defend me, Jonah. Just live kindly. That's all I ever wanted from any of you." There was a long pause. Then he said, "I will. I promise." After we hung up, I sat for a long time listening to the dial tone fade into nothing, feeling neither triumph nor regret, only the strange serenity of a woman who has finally stopped needing to be understood. The garden bloomed early that year, perhaps because I tended it with a steadier hand. The roses, the same ones I had nearly abandoned seasons ago, returned with color so vivid it almost startled me. Each morning, I walked among them, touching the petals, whispering names under my breath like prayers. Memory, forgiveness, beginning. Sometimes I thought of my husband and wondered what he would have said about all this. I imagined his voice, low and calm, telling me that it was about time I stopped apologizing for being right. He always did have a quiet sense of justice, one that didn't need to announce itself. I like to think he would have been proud, not because I kept the money or gave it away, but because I finally understood the difference between giving out of love and giving out of fear. News travels quickly, even among those who pretend not to care. A distant cousin called to tell me that Nina and Matthew had cut me off, that they'd told the family I was confused and influenced. I thanked her for the update, then changed the subject to the weather. Their story didn't bother me. Every person edits history to protect the version of themselves they can bear to live with. I had done it too, for decades, polishing over their indifference, convincing myself that silence was shyness, that neglect was independence. Now that illusion had shattered, and what remained was strangely beautiful, raw, uneven, but real. In the afternoons, I began writing again, not letters this time, not journals filled with apology or longing, but short pieces of memory, fragments of thought. I wrote about my mother's hands, about the way sunlight used to fall across my husband's shoulders when he read the newspaper, about the quiet dignity of growing older and not needing to be anyone's center anymore. Writing felt like sweeping dust from forgotten corners. It didn't change the past, but it made the present inhabitable. One morning, I received a small package from Jonah. Inside was a framed photograph of my garden taken during his last visit, and a short note. "Thank you for teaching me what it means to give without asking." I placed it on the mantel beside the picture of his father. For the first time in many years, those two faces, the man I had loved and the son who still knew how to love, looked at peace together. Autumn came again, gentle and slow. The leaves turned to gold and then to ash, and I found comfort in their honesty. Decay, I realized, was not an ending, but a soft translation of what had been into what would be. Sometimes, when the evenings grew long and the light turned honey-colored, I would sit by the window with my tea and imagine other women like me, sitting in other houses, weighing the invisible debts of love and gratitude. To them, if I could have spoken, I would have said this: "You are not cruel for wanting peace. You are not selfish for asking to be seen. You are not heartless for giving less when no one bothered to thank you for giving everything." Now the house is quiet again, but it is a different kind of quiet, one that listens rather than accuses. I move through its rooms without nostalgia, only recognition. I keep the letters from Matthew and Nina in a small box, not out of bitterness, but as proof of the story's truth. Someday, after I am gone, perhaps they will find them, along with the will, and perhaps they will understand. Or perhaps not. It no longer matters. Understanding, like gratitude, cannot be demanded. It has to arrive on its own, late but sincere. As for me, I am content. I walk each morning through the garden that once witnessed my sorrow and now keeps my peace. The roses still bloom, the kettle still sings, and the light still spills across the kitchen floor. I sit at the table, take a slow sip of tea, and think of how everything in this world, love, trust, forgiveness, grows best when it is finally left to breathe. I am 70, and I have learned that closure is not a door that slams, but a window that opens quietly to let the air in. If my children ever come back, they will find me here, not waiting, not angry, simply alive. And if they never do, the garden will remember us all the same.